AITAH for telling my brothers I won't be the one be our mom's caretaker? It was a simple question. One that shouldn't have carried the weight that it did. But when my brother, Alex, casually asked, "Who's going to take care of mom when she's older?" it felt like the air was sucked out of the room. We were sitting at his apartment. My youngest brother, Mark, sprawled on the couch, half paying attention to the conversation while scrolling through his phone. It was a typical Saturday, nothing remarkable about it. Yet, that one question set off a chain reaction in my head. A storm of emotions I hadn't prepared for. I stayed quiet, staring at the half-empty beer bottle in my hand, hoping they'd move on to something else. I wasn't ready for this. I wasn't ready to talk about what taking care of our mother would mean for me. For all of us. But Alex wasn't letting it go. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His expression a mixture of curiosity and mild concern. I mean, she's 65 now, and she's still working full-time. She's probably going to have to work until she physically can't anymore. We should start thinking about what happens when that day comes. I could feel my throat tighten. I wanted to say something, but the words were caught somewhere between anger and guilt, stuck in the place where I kept all the unresolved feelings about our mother. I glanced over at Mark, who hadn't said anything either, still engrossed in whatever was on his phone. He lived with mom, surely he'd have something to say about this. But he didn't. The silence stretched on, and I knew it was my turn to respond. I could feel both of my brothers waiting for me to weigh in, to offer some solution, some reassurance that we'd figure it out, like I always had in the past. Instead, I finally muttered, "I don't know." Alex looked confused. "You don't know? Come on, man, we've got to think about this at some point." I felt the tension in my chest rising. I knew where this conversation was heading, and I didn't want to go there. I had already spent enough of my life thinking about our mother. I didn't need to add another layer to the complicated mess that had been our childhood. "I'm serious. I don't know," I said, more forcefully this time, my voice sharper than I intended. Alex's brows furrowed, and I could see the question forming in his mind. He didn't get it. He didn't understand why this was such a loaded question for me. But how could he? He was 26 now. A full 9 years younger than me. When I was 14, barely holding our family together. He was just a little kid. Too young to grasp what was happening. And Mark? He was even younger. They didn't see the things I saw. They didn't feel the weight of it like I did. Growing up, our mother wasn't just a distant figure in the background. She was a hurricane, a storm of bad decisions and emotional chaos that ripped through our lives. She cheated on our father with his best friend, driving him out of the house she inherited from my grandparents. That was the beginning of the end. After Dad left, everything spiraled. Our mother became a shell of herself, hooked on drugs, reckless with money, and incapable of providing any stability. I took over where she failed. At 14, I shouldn't have been the one making sure the bills were paid, that the lights stayed on, or that my younger brothers had food on the table. But that's exactly what I did. I didn't have a choice. Mom's car got repossessed, and the bills piled up until we were left with no heat, no electricity, doing homework by candlelight and taking cold showers because the water heater didn't work. I was a kid, but I had to be the adult in that house. It wasn't just the financial mess, though. It was her, too. The drugs, the endless string of boyfriends, the nights she'd leave us alone, sneaking out in the middle of the night only to return in the morning with some flimsy excuse. I had to lie to Alex and Mark, telling them she'd just gone to the store or ran an errand, even though I knew she'd been out doing God knows what. And when I had finally had enough, when I flushed her stash down the toilet, I paid for it. She beat me, not a slap or a shove, but a full-on beating that left me with bruises and the realization that I was truly on my own. I don't think my brothers remember that. Or if they do, they've chosen not to. It's easier for them to remember the good times, to look back on our childhood with those rose-tinted glasses they've always had on. They remember me playing video games with them, taking them to get lunch, letting them sleep in my room when they were scared. They see those moments, not the nights when I lay awake wondering if Mom would ever come home. Or how I'd explain to Dad that I couldn't fix everything, no matter how hard I tried. So when Alex asked who was going to take care of her, all I could think was, not me. I had already done my part. I had spent my teenage years raising them, taking care of her, being the one to pick up the pieces every time she shattered. I was tired. I couldn't do it again. But I couldn't say that. Not yet. I mean, someone's going to have to eventually. Alex continued, oblivious to the storm brewing in my head. She's still working as a hairdresser. But how long can she keep doing that? She's 65. Man, it's only a matter of time before she can't keep up anymore. I know, I said, my voice tight, but that doesn't mean we have to be the ones to take care of her. That got Mark's attention. He looked up from his phone. Confused. What do you mean? She's our mom. I felt my hands clench into fists under the table. I didn't want to be the one to say it. But it needed to be said. She made her choices. We don't owe her anything. She's the one who put herself in this situation. Mark frowned. Come on, that's not fair. She's clean now. She's been working hard for years. We can't just abandon her when she needs us. I wanted to laugh. Clean? Maybe. But she was still a functioning alcoholic. Still a drain on anyone who tried to get close to her. And sure, she'd been working. But that didn't erase the years of damage she'd done. It didn't change the fact that she was the reason our lives had been so chaotic. I'm not saying abandon her, I said, struggling to keep my voice calm. But I'm not going to be her caretaker. Not after everything. Alex looked at me, confused and a little hurt. You're really just going to leave it to us? I sighed, running a hand through my hair. If one of you wants to take care of her, fine, you can have the house when she's gone. But I can't do it. I've done my part. They didn't get it. I could see it in their faces. They didn't understand why I was being so cold, why I was drawing this line. But they hadn't lived the life I had. They hadn't been the one to pick up the pieces when everything fell apart. I love you guys, I said softly, trying to bridge the gap that was forming between us. But our mom has been exhausting to have in my life. I can't do this again. Neither of them responded. The silence stretched on, heavy and uncomfortable, until finally, Alex shrugged and leaned back in his chair. All right, I guess we'll figure something out. I nodded, knowing that the conversation was far from over. They didn't understand, not yet, but they would. They had to. The memories of my childhood have always felt like they belonged to someone else, someone much older. Someone who shouldn't have had to grow up so quickly. I wasn't a kid in the usual sense. Not in the way my brothers were. My memories are laced with responsibility, fear, and a constant sense of dread. I often wondered if my brothers remembered any of it the way I did. Or if they only saw the parts of our childhood that I worked so hard to protect them from. It all started when I was 14. Right after our dad left. He didn't want to go. I know that now. But mom gave him no choice. She cheated on him with his best friend. And after the truth came out, she kicked him out of the house, my grandparents' house. Technically, she inherited it from them. And that gave her all the power. I remember the day he left so vividly. Standing there in the doorway as he packed his bags, trying to explain to me why he couldn't stay. But there wasn't a good enough explanation. There never was. That was when everything changed. After dad left, it didn't take long for mom to fall apart. At first, it was subtle. She'd stay out late, telling us she was working extra hours at the salon. But I knew better. Then came the drugs. She wasn't hiding it very well, disappearing at night. Coming home in the early morning hours. Pretending like everything was fine. My brothers were too young to notice. But I did. I had to grow up fast. I didn't have a choice. Mom wasn't paying the bills, she was too wrapped up in whatever she was using. And soon, the money ran out. I was too young to work. But I had to figure something out. The electricity was cut off. The water heater stopped working. And we spent months in the dark. Lighting candles at night and taking cold showers. I couldn't tell anyone, couldn't let the school know what was happening at home. I was terrified of being separated from my brothers, of someone realizing how bad things had gotten. So I kept it quiet. I kept everything quiet. I did my best to shield them from it all. To make sure they were fed, clothed, and taken care of. I was their older brother. But more than that, I was their parent. I was the one who got them up for school, made sure they did their homework, and tucked them in at night. I didn't have time to be a kid. I didn't have time for anything. Really, it was survival, day in and day out. I remember one night, in particular, when everything finally hit me. I was sitting at the kitchen table, trying to finish my homework by candlelight, and I heard the front door creak open. Mom had left hours ago. Thinking we were all asleep, I watched as she snuck back in, her clothes disheveled, her eyes glazed over. She didn't say a word to me, just walked past me like I wasn't even there. I didn't know if she was high, drunk, or just tired from whatever she had been doing. But I knew in that moment that I couldn't count on her. I couldn't trust her to be the mother we needed. I hated her for it. I hated her for leaving me to pick up the pieces, for making me grow up before I was ready, and for abandoning us in every way that mattered. I hated her for the nights I stayed up worrying about how we'd keep the lights on, how we'd make it to the end of the month with what little money we had left. I hated her for making me responsible for my brothers when it wasn't supposed to be my job. But the worst part was, I couldn't hate her in front of my brothers. They didn't understand what was really going on, and I couldn't let them see how bad things were. They were just kids. Alex was only 8, and Mark was 5. They didn't know about the drugs, the money problems, the men Mom brought home when she thought we were asleep. They just saw her as our mom. I was the only one who saw the truth. I was the one who had to sit them down when the power went out and tell them we were having a campout in my room. I was the one who made sure they didn't notice the empty cupboards, who used what little money we had to buy cheap meals and pretend everything was fine. I was the one who dealt with the landlord when Mom couldn't pay rent, trying to stall eviction notices with whatever excuse I could come up with. They never saw the worst of it. And that's exactly how I wanted it. I wanted them to have a childhood, even if I couldn't. There was a night I'll never forget, though, a moment that still sits heavy in my chest. Even now, I came home from school, and there was a thick tension in the air. I could feel it as soon as I walked through the door. Mom was home early, and that was never a good sign. She was in the living room, sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the TV. But it wasn't the normal haze she was in. Something was different. I went to my room to drop my bag off, and that's when I saw it. Her stash. A bag of pills and powder sitting on my dresser. Like she'd forgotten where she left it. Without thinking, I grabbed it and marched back to the living room. I was angry. Angrier than I'd ever been in my life. I couldn't stand it anymore, the lies, the destruction, the constant weight on my shoulders. I walked straight past her, into the bathroom, and dumped the entire bag into the toilet. I flushed it, and the sound of it disappearing into the pipes felt like a momentary release. A fleeting moment of power in a world where I had none. But the fallout was immediate. She screamed. She lunged at me, her face twisted in rage, and hit me harder than I'd ever been hit before. I didn't fight back. I just stood there, letting her take out every ounce of her anger on me. When it was over, I wasn't just bruised on the outside. I was broken inside. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering how I was going to keep doing this, how I was going to keep holding everything together. I didn't have an answer. I still don't. Eventually, Mom got clean. Not long after that, the drugs were gone, but the damage remained. She traded her addiction for alcohol. But by that point, I had already checked out emotionally. I stopped caring whether or not she was sober. I stopped caring whether or not she was around. I was too busy trying to survive. Too busy trying to make sure Alex and Mark got through school. Too busy trying to figure out what I was going to do with my life once I got out of that house. And when I finally did leave, it wasn't with a sense of relief. It was with guilt. Guilt that I was abandoning my brothers, even though I'd spent years taking care of them. Guilt that I hadn't done enough to fix everything, even though it was never my job to fix it in the first place. So now, when Alex and Mark ask me about taking care of Mom in her old age, all I can think about is how I spent my childhood taking care of her. Taking care of them, and taking care of a situation that never should have been mine to handle. I did my part. I shouldn't have to do it again. As much as I wanted to forget those years, they were a part of me, woven into every decision I'd made. Every path I'd taken since I was 14. But as much as they defined me, they seemed to have left little mark on my brothers. At least, that's how it felt sometimes. To them, our childhood wasn't filled with trauma or hardship. In fact, they seemed to look back on it fondly, as if the most difficult thing we ever faced was figuring out who would play video games first. That difference in perspective has always driven a wedge between us, an unspoken division that I wasn't sure could ever be bridged. They saw our mom through a completely different lens. I didn't blame them for it, but it made things complicated, especially now, with the conversation about taking care of her looming like a dark cloud over everything. I was 9 years older than Alex and 12 years older than Mark. By the time I was old enough to realize just how bad things were, they were still too young to understand what was happening. They thought Mom was fun, unpredictable, and cool. To them, she was the mom who let them stay up late, Who let them have sleepovers in my room when the power went out? They remembered me sneaking them extra snacks, playing video games with them for hours, and taking them to get lunch when mom was too busy to do it herself. What they didn't see, what I shielded them from, was the chaos behind all of that. They didn't see mom's violent mood swings, or the times I had to lie to our landlord to keep us from being evicted. They didn't understand that when I was letting them sleep in my room, it wasn't because I wanted to, it was because the whole house felt unsafe. And I couldn't stand the idea of them being alone while mom was off God knows where. To Alex and Mark, I was just their big brother who took care of them, who made things fun when life got tough. They had no idea I was barely holding it together. And now, years later, they still didn't see it. Even though they knew the facts, they knew about mom's affair. Her addiction, the financial mess she dragged us through, it didn't seem to affect them the way it affected me. Maybe they had compartmentalized it. Or maybe they were just too young at the time to fully grasp the weight of what we went through. Either way, they didn't hold the same resentment for our mother that I did. They saw her as someone who had turned her life around. Someone who had made mistakes but deserved forgiveness. I wasn't there yet. I wasn't sure if I'd ever be there. But I couldn't explain that to them. Not in a way they would fully understand. When I told them I didn't want to be mom's caretaker, they looked at me like I had just abandoned them all over again. Like I had walked away from my responsibilities, leaving them to pick up the pieces. But I'd done that before. I'd spent years picking up the pieces. And I was tired of being the only one who saw just how broken everything really was. I love my brothers. They're two of the most important people in my life. I would do anything for them, anything. Except this, I couldn't be the one to take care of her. Not again. It wasn't just about the logistics, the financial burden, or even the physical toll it would take. It was about the emotional exhaustion. It was about the years of resentment, guilt, and anger that I'd buried so deep inside that I wasn't sure I'd ever be able to fully dig it out. Alex was the one who pressed the issue the most. He wasn't angry, not really, but he was frustrated. He didn't understand why I couldn't just step up again like I had in the past. He thought I was being cold, distant, maybe even a little selfish. He didn't say it outright, but I could feel it in the way he looked at me. The way he sighed when I told him that our mom's future wasn't my responsibility. Look, man, I get it, Alex said one evening when we were having dinner. I know things were tough back then. I know you had to deal with a lot of stuff I didn't see. But it's different now. She's different now. Different. He kept saying that, as if a few years of sobriety wiped away the damage. As if the woman who spent my teenage years disappearing for days, who hit me when I tried to save her from herself, was suddenly a brand new person. She's still drinking, I said, my voice sharper than I intended. She might not be on drugs anymore. But she's not exactly clean. Alex shrugged, like it didn't matter. Yeah, but it's not like it used to be. She's working. She's paying her bills. She's barely getting by. I interrupted. And just because she's holding it together now doesn't mean she'll be able to do it forever. What happens when she can't? He didn't have an answer for that. Mark, who was sitting across from us, stayed quiet the entire time. He usually did. As the youngest, he had always been the peacekeeper, the one who wanted everyone to get along. But even now, I could tell he was siding with Alex. He didn't understand why I couldn't let go of the past. It's not about whether she's changed or not, I said after a long pause. It's about the fact that I've already done this. I've already taken care of her. Of both of you. I was the one who kept everything together back then. And I can't do it again. Alex leaned back in his chair, frowning. I'm not saying it's all on you. We'll help, but someone has to take responsibility for her. That someone's not going to be me. I said quietly, but firmly. I can't. It felt like I was drawing a line in the sand. A line I knew they didn't want to cross. But I had to. I wasn't going to spend the rest of my life taking care of the person who had destroyed my childhood. I wasn't going to sacrifice my peace, my well-being, for someone who had never been there for me when I needed her the most. I glanced over at Mark, who still hadn't said anything. He was 23 now, still living at home with mom, and they had a different relationship, one that I couldn't fully understand. She favored him, always had. He was the baby, the one she doted on when she was sober enough to care. He didn't get the worst of her. By the time he was old enough to see what was happening, I had already taken over most of the parental responsibilities. And mom had started to pull herself together, at least. On the surface, Mark had always been her perfect son, the one she relied on for emotional support, the one she saw as her redemption story. And maybe that was why he hadn't said anything. Maybe he knew, deep down, that he was the one who would end up taking care of her. I could see it in the way he avoided eye contact, in the way he stayed silent while Alex and I went back and forth. He wasn't ready to admit it yet, but he knew. The conversation ended the way most of our conversations about Mom did, unfinished. Unresolved. Alex and I agreed to disagree. And Mark stayed out of it. As always. But there was something hanging in the air between us. Something I knew we'd have to face sooner or later. Our mother was getting older. And the day would come when she wouldn't be able to take care of herself anymore. When that day came, someone would have to step up. But it wasn't going to be me. I had already done my time. As much as I tried to move past the conversation with my brothers, it lingered in my mind, weighing me down like a stone in my chest. The more I thought about it, the more it became clear that what they saw as coldness or selfishness on my part was something much deeper: exhaustion. I had spent most of my life carrying burdens that were never meant for me. And I was simply too tired to pick them up again. When people talk about responsibility, they often think of it as a badge of honor, a sign of maturity. I guess that's true in some ways. But for me, responsibility was more like a chain. Something that had been wrapped around me so tightly during my teenage years that I didn't even realize how much it was strangling me until I was an adult. I spent so much time taking care of everyone else, my brothers, my mom, that I forgot what it felt like to just be a kid. I think that's part of the reason why I chose not to have children. People think that decision was about my wife, or about the fact that we both wanted to focus on our careers and our life together. But the truth is, it was mostly about me. I had a vasectomy when I was 30. And I didn't hesitate for a second. I knew that I didn't want to be responsible for another life. Because I'd already done my share of raising kids. I didn't talk about it much with my brothers. But I think they knew. They just didn't understand why. It's not that I don't love them, I do. Deeply. I'd go to the ends of the earth for Alex and Mark. But my decision to get a vasectomy wasn't about them as much as it was about the crushing exhaustion I still carried from my teenage years. Being responsible for other people, especially when you're too young to bear that kind of weight, drains you in a way that's hard to explain. When you're 14 and you're the only one in the house paying bills, making meals, and making sure your younger brothers are safe, it changes you. There's no freedom in it. No time to be selfish. No room to dream about your own future. Every decision I made back then wasn't about me, it was about survival. For me and for them. After I moved out, I thought that weight would lift. I thought that once I was on my own, once I had my own life, my own apartment, my own job, things would be different. And in some ways, they were. I didn't have to come home every day to a house filled with tension and uncertainty. I didn't have to worry about whether or not we'd have electricity or food in the fridge. But even though I left that house behind, the weight of those years never really left me. Even after I moved out, I was still taking care of Alex and Mark. It wasn't as intense as it had been when we were younger. But it was still there. I'd buy them school clothes, help with their homework, drive them to and from school when Mom couldn't, or wouldn't. I still felt responsible for them, even though I wasn't living under the same roof anymore. And in the back of my mind, I always knew that if something went wrong, it would be on me to fix it. That's what I did. I fixed things. I made sure we survived. And that's why, when Alex told me I didn't have the caretaker instinct, it cut me deeper than I'd expected. I had spent years taking care of them, raising them while our mother spiraled out of control. I had spent my entire teenage life being a caretaker when I should have been out with friends, going to football games, worrying about nothing more than my next math test. I remember one day in particular, not long after I had moved out, when Mom called me. It was one of those frantic, middle-of-the-night calls that always set me on edge. Alex and Mark were still in high school, and she was sobbing, saying something about how she couldn't pay the rent and the landlord was threatening to kick them out. It didn't surprise me, even after she supposedly got clean. She was still terrible with money. She hadn't paid rent in 2 months. And now everything was coming to a head. I was 21, working 2 part-time jobs and going to community college, barely scraping by myself, but I couldn't let them get evicted. So I took the little savings I had and wired it to her landlord. It wasn't enough to cover everything, but it bought them some time. I didn't even ask for a thank you. I didn't expect one. That was the thing. Being responsible for someone else's life means you don't get to expect gratitude. You do what needs to be done. And you keep doing it. Because the alternative is unthinkable. If I didn't take care of them, who would? That's the question that haunted me for years. Now, though, things were different. Alex and Mark were adults. They had their own lives. Their own futures to think about. And as much as I loved them, I couldn't be the one to step up again when our mother's health started to decline. I couldn't be her caretaker. Not after everything she put us through. I had already been a caretaker for too long. I had already sacrificed my childhood, my teenage years, my early 20s, to make sure my brothers survived. I couldn't go back to that place. I couldn't put myself in that position again. When I told them that they could take care of Mom if they wanted to. That whoever did would get the house when she passed. It wasn't just me drawing a boundary, it was me choosing my own peace. For the first time in my life, I was choosing not to be the one who took on all the responsibility. I was choosing not to be the one who held everything together. And it hurt. It hurt to see the look in Alex's eyes. The frustration and confusion. It hurt even more to know that Mark was silently judging me. Even if he wasn't saying it out loud. But I had to do it. I had to choose myself this time. I had done my part. I had raised them. I had taken care of her. And now, I was exhausted. The truth is, my mother's problems weren't just financial. It wasn't just about the bills, the drinking, or her inability to manage her life. It was about the emotional toll of being around her. Even now, years later, being in the same room with her made me feel like I was 14 again. Trapped in that house with no way out. I couldn't breathe when she was around. I couldn't think straight. The anxiety that had been my constant companion during those years came rushing back every time I saw her. That was the real reason I couldn't be her caretaker. It wasn't just the logistics, the money, or the time. It was the emotional weight. The overwhelming sense of dread that came with the idea of being responsible for her again. I couldn't carry that weight anymore. Even after standing my ground with my brothers. The guilt lingered like an unwelcome guest in the back of my mind. I knew, logically, that I had every right to say no. I had already sacrificed so much. Too much. For the sake of our family. But logic rarely holds much power over emotion. The guilt wasn't something I could shake with a simple declaration. And in the quiet moments, it crept up on me, whispering doubts and accusations. Was I being selfish? Was I abandoning my family? Couldn't I just push through the exhaustion one last time for the sake of my brothers? For the sake of my mother? These questions kept me awake at night, staring at the ceiling while the weight of my decision pressed down on me. I thought about all the times I had come through for my brothers. I had been there for them when no one else was. I was the one who raised them, who got them ready for school, who made sure they ate when our mom couldn't be bothered. I was the one who picked them up when they fell, who comforted them when they cried because mom wasn't home. I did all of that. And now I was the one being called selfish for not wanting to take care of her in the end. But was that what I was, selfish? I didn't think so, but the doubt gnawed at me. Growing up, I had always been the responsible one. It wasn't a role I chose, but it was one that had been thrust upon me. And once you get labeled as the responsible one, the dependable one, it's hard to shake that expectation. I had spent years being the glue that held our fractured family together. And now that I was choosing to step back, it felt like I was betraying that identity. Betraying the version of myself that my brothers had come to rely on. The worst part was that I knew my brothers didn't see things the way I did. They had accepted that our mother was flawed, that she had made mistakes. But they didn't hold it against her the way I did. They didn't feel the same anger or resentment. And I envied them for that. They could forgive her, move on, and look at her through a lens softened by love and nostalgia. But I couldn't. I wasn't ready for that kind of forgiveness. I wasn't sure I ever would be. That's when the guilt started to twist into something else. It wasn't just guilt for not wanting to take care of mom. It was guilt for not being able to forgive her. Was I holding onto my resentment as a way to justify my decision? Was I using her past mistakes as an excuse to avoid responsibility now? These thoughts plagued me, making it harder and harder to trust my own judgment. One night, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at my phone, drafting a message to my brothers. I needed them to understand, truly understand, why I couldn't be mom's caretaker. It wasn't about abandoning her. It wasn't about being cold or selfish. It was about preserving what little peace I had managed to carve out for myself after years of chaos. I started typing, my fingers moving almost automatically across the screen. I know you think I'm being cold by not wanting to take care of Mom. But please try to see where I'm coming from. I spent most of my childhood taking care of you guys, making sure you were okay while Mom was off doing her own thing. I did everything I could to shield you from the worst of it. But that took a toll on me. I had to grow up too fast. And I never got a chance to be just a kid. I was the one who had to deal with the power getting shut off, the bills piling up, and the nights when we didn't know where Mom was. I paused, staring at the words, feeling the weight of them. I wasn't sure if they would understand. How could they, when their memories of our childhood were so different from mine? But I needed to try. I needed them to know that my decision wasn't made lightly. I continued typing. I'm not saying this to make you feel guilty or to throw anything in your face. I'm just trying to explain why this is so hard for me. I've already been Mom's caretaker. I've already done that job. And it nearly broke me. I can't do it again. I'm exhausted. I've been exhausted for years. I'm not saying I won't help out. I'll make sure she has what she needs. But I can't be the one to bear the full responsibility for her care. I just can't. I hesitated before hitting send. A part of me was afraid of what they'd say in response. Would they accuse me of being cold again? Would they see this as me making excuses, trying to get out of something that was inevitable? Or would they finally understand? I sent the message and waited, feeling like I had laid a piece of myself bare for them to see. I wasn't asking for forgiveness or validation. I just wanted them to understand, to realize that my decision wasn't rooted in selfishness but in self-preservation. The reply didn't come right away, and the hours that passed felt like an eternity. Finally, my phone buzzed, and Alex's message appeared on the screen. I'm not trying to make you feel guilty. And I get where you're coming from. I know you took care of us when we were kids. And I'm not trying to say you didn't. I shouldn't have said you don't have the caretaker instinct. I was thinking about it more in terms of being a parent. Since you've said you don't want kids. But I wasn't trying to make it sound like you didn't take care of us. I get it. I read the message a few times, letting the words sink in. It wasn't exactly a full understanding, but it was something. Alex was acknowledging the role I had played in their lives. And that was enough for now. He wasn't pushing the issue anymore. And maybe, just maybe, he was starting to see things from my perspective. Mark didn't respond, but I didn't expect him to. He had always been more reserved, less inclined to get involved in family disputes. I knew he would talk to Alex about it eventually. And I hoped that in time, he would come to the same understanding. But even with Alex's response, the guilt still clung to me. It wasn't something that could be resolved with a single conversation or a well-crafted text. It was something deeper, something tied to the years of responsibility I had carried on my shoulders. It was the weight of knowing that no matter what, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was letting someone down. In the end, I knew I couldn't make everyone happy. My brothers would find their own way to handle our mother's care. And I would help where I could. But I had to protect myself. I had to draw the line somewhere. Or I'd end up right back where I started, trapped in a cycle of caretaking that had defined my entire youth. The guilt might never fully go away, but at least I was finally learning to put myself first. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like a step in the right direction. The message to my brothers helped ease some of the tension, but I knew there was one more conversation I needed to have, a conversation I had been dreading for years. It was time to talk to my mom. The thought of confronting her, of reopening old wounds that had never fully healed, filled me with anxiety, but it was unavoidable. If I was going to put this burden to rest, I needed to be honest with her. She had to know that I wouldn't be the one to take care of her. No matter how much it might hurt to say it. I tried to delay it as long as possible, making excuses to myself about why the timing wasn't right. But deep down, I knew there would never be a right time. This conversation would hurt, no matter when it happened. Still, if I wanted to move on and live my life without the shadow of her care looming over me, I had to face it. One Saturday afternoon, I found myself driving to my mom's house. The old, familiar road that led to the house I had grown up in was a bittersweet reminder of everything I had gone through. The house hadn't changed much since I left. The peeling paint, the overgrown front yard, the same worn-out mailbox that had been there since I was a kid. It was like a physical manifestation of my unresolved past. Stuck in time, I parked outside and sat in the car for a few moments. taking deep breaths and gathering my thoughts. I could already feel my chest tightening, my heartbeat quickening. It was as if my body remembered the anxiety and fear that had come with living in this house. Even if I had spent years trying to forget, the idea of stepping inside made me feel like I was 14 again. Back in the thick of it all, trying to keep everything from falling apart. Finally, I mustered the courage to step out of the car and walk to the front door. Before I could knock, my mom opened it, as if she had been waiting for me. She looked older than I remembered, more worn down by the years. Her hair, once vibrant and full of life, was now streaked with gray, and her eyes carried the weight of too many hard-lived years. Still, she smiled when she saw me, and for a brief second, I felt guilty for what I was about to say. "Hey, honey," she greeted me, stepping aside to let me in. "Didn't know you were coming by." I nodded, stepping into the living room, which was exactly as I remembered, cluttered with old furniture, faded family photos on the walls, the smell of stale cigarettes lingering in the air. I sat down on the couch, the same couch I had sat on as a teenager, worrying about the bills, my brothers, and everything else that had been too big for me to handle back then. She sat down across from me, and there was a brief, awkward silence. I could feel her waiting for me to say something, to explain why I had come by unannounced. My stomach churned with the weight of what I needed to tell her. I hadn't rehearsed this, hadn't planned out the right words, because I knew there were no right words for something like this. "I need to talk to you about something," I finally said, my voice tight and uncertain. "It's about the future. About what's going to happen when you get older." Her expression shifted slightly, a flicker of concern crossing her face. She stayed quiet, waiting for me to continue. I swallowed hard, pushing through the discomfort. "Mom, I want to be honest with you," I began, my hands fidgeting in my lap. "I've been thinking about what happens when you can't take care of yourself anymore. And I need you to know that I won't be the one to take care of you." As soon as the words left my mouth, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. But it was immediately replaced by a new kind of heaviness, the kind that comes with hurting someone you care about, even when you know it's the right thing to do. She blinked, her face registering the shock. For a moment, she didn't say anything, and I wasn't sure how to read her reaction. Was she angry? Hurt? Disappointed? I had no idea. "Okay," she finally said, her voice quieter than I expected. "Why are you telling me this now?" I sighed, rubbing the back of my neck, trying to find the words to explain. "Because I need you to understand that it's not about me not loving you or not caring about you. It's just, I've already spent so much of my life taking care of you, of Alex and Mark, and I can't do it again. I'm exhausted, Mom. I've been exhausted for years." Her eyes softened, but I could see the hurt in them. I wasn't sure if she fully understood, but she was listening, and that was more than I expected. "I know you've been through a lot," she said, her voice a little shaky. "I know things weren't easy back then. But I'm different now. I've changed." I shook my head gently. "I'm glad you're in a better place now. But that doesn't erase what happened. I've already spent so many years being the responsible one, holding everything together, and I can't go back to that. I can't." She nodded slowly, looking down at her hands, her fingers fiddling with the edge of her sleeve. "I never asked you to do all that. You know." Her words stung more than I expected. It wasn't about whether she had asked, it was about the fact that she hadn't needed to. I had stepped in because no one else did. I had taken on the role of caretaker because I couldn't bear to see my brothers suffer the way I had. "I know you didn't ask," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "But I didn't have a choice. I had to grow up too fast. And I can't go back to that place. I need to live my own life now." She looked up at me, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I get it," she whispered. "I do. I always thought that, in the end, family took care of each other." I swallowed the lump in my throat, struggling to hold back the wave of emotions that was threatening to crash over me. "Family does take care of each other," I said quietly, "but I've already taken care of you. I took care of Alex and Mark. I've done my part." Another silence stretched between us, heavy with the weight of everything that had gone unsaid over the years. I could see the pain in her face, but I knew I couldn't take it back. This was the truth, and for once in my life, I had to put myself first. Eventually, she nodded, wiping away a tear that had slipped down her cheek. "I understand," she said softly, though I wasn't entirely sure she did. But it was enough. For now, It was enough. I stood up to leave, feeling emotionally drained, but also strangely lighter. It wasn't the closure I had hoped for, but it was a start. I had finally said what needed to be said, and no matter how much it hurt, I knew it was the right thing to do. As I walked out the front door and back to my car, I couldn't help but feel a mix of relief and sadness. The weight of responsibility I had carried for so long was finally starting to lift. But with it came the realization that some wounds never fully heal. But I had done what I needed to do. I had set my boundaries. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was finally choosing myself. After my conversation with Mom, I felt a strange sense of relief. Like a weight had been lifted. But it wasn't a triumphant feeling. It was more of an exhaustion. The kind that settles in after a long battle. I had said what I needed to say. And while she hadn't fully understood, I had at least made it clear where I stood. But I knew the real test of my decision would come when I talked to my brothers. Telling them I wasn't going to take care of Mom had been one thing. Actually following through with it and dealing with the fallout was another. A few days later, I decided it was time to address things with Alex and Mark again. We couldn't keep dancing around this conversation forever. It needed to be out in the open, even if it meant reopening some of the wounds from our last discussion. Alex had softened after my text, but I knew he still had questions. And Mark hadn't said anything at all. We met up at Alex's apartment. It felt like a neutral ground, somewhere that wasn't too tied to our past. As I sat on the worn-out couch, waiting for Mark to arrive, I could feel the tension building. Alex was making small talk, asking about my work and how my wife was doing. But we both knew that wasn't why we were here. I tried to go along with it, answering his questions and pretending everything was fine. But it was hard to shake the feeling that things were about to get messy again. Mark finally showed up, looking as quiet and contemplative as ever. He gave me a nod when he walked in, then took a seat across from me without saying much. That was typical for Mark. He was never the one to start a tough conversation. He'd sit and listen, waiting for someone else to speak first. And like always, it looked like I was going to have to be the one to get things going. I talked to Mom, I said, cutting through the tension like a knife. Told her I'm not going to be her caretaker. Mark's expression didn't change, but I saw a flicker of something, recognition. Maybe. Alex, on the other hand, leaned forward, his brow furrowed. How'd she take it? He asked, his voice cautious, as if he was bracing himself for bad news. I shrugged, trying to keep my tone neutral. Better than I expected. Honestly, she didn't argue with me or try to guilt-trip me into changing my mind. But she's hurt, obviously. Alex nodded slowly. Well, yeah, she probably thought we'd all just step up when the time came. I bit back a sigh. That was the problem. The assumption that we would all just step up. No questions asked. No regard for the emotional toll it might take. But I wasn't going to rehash all of that again. Not right now. I know, I said, my voice quieter now. But I had to be honest with her. I can't take that on. Not after everything. There was a silence that hung between us. Heavy and uncomfortable. I could feel the judgment lingering in the air. Even if neither of them was saying it out loud. They didn't get it. Not fully. They didn't understand how much it had taken out of me to raise them. To hold everything together when Mom couldn't. Alex broke the silence first. His voice softer now. Look, I get it. You've been through more with her than we have. But you're not alone this time. We're adults now. We can all help out. I shook my head, my frustration bubbling up despite my best efforts to keep it down. It's not just about having help. It's about the emotional weight of it all. I can't go back to that place. Alex, I can't put myself through that again. Mark, who had been silent this whole time, finally spoke up. You don't have to. I've already accepted that I'll probably be the one to take care of her. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had always known, deep down, that Mark would be the one to step up. He still lived with her, after all, and their relationship was different from mine. He didn't have the same scars I did. But hearing him say it out loud made it feel real. Made it feel final. Are you sure? I asked, trying to keep the concern out of my voice. You don't have to do this just because you live with her. Mark shrugged, but there was a quiet resignation in his eyes. I know I don't have to. But she's my mom. I don't have the same history with her that you do. It's not as hard for me to deal with. I wanted to argue with him. To tell him that he shouldn't have to carry this burden. That none of us should. But the truth was, He had already made up his mind. And part of me was relieved. Relieved that I wasn't going to have to fight this battle alone. That someone else was willing to step in. But the relief was tinged with guilt. Too. Guilt that I was letting my younger brother take on a role that I had been avoiding. "I'll help out where I can," Alex added, his tone more measured now. "We're not going to let this fall entirely on you, Mark. We'll figure it out together." I nodded, grateful that Alex was at least offering to share the load. But I still couldn't shake the feeling that I was somehow abandoning my brothers. Leaving them to clean up the mess that I had spent years trying to hold together. "I'll help too," I said, knowing I couldn't walk away completely. "I'll take her to the grocery store. Make sure she has what she needs. But I can't be the one to take care of her full-time." Mark gave me a small nod. And I could see that he understood. He wasn't angry. And he wasn't going to hold it against me. That was a small comfort. "I get it," he said quietly. "You did your part when we were kids. I'm not going to make you feel guilty about it." I felt my shoulders relax. A tension I hadn't realized I'd been carrying finally releasing. Maybe this wasn't the perfect resolution. But it was something. We weren't going to agree on everything. But at least they understood where I was coming from. They didn't see me as the selfish, cold-hearted brother who refused to step up. They saw me as someone who had already given too much. The conversation shifted after that. We started talking logistics. What would happen when Mom's health declined? How we'd split responsibilities. What kind of financial support she might need. It was a practical conversation. And for the first time, I felt like we were all on the same page. Mark was willing to take on the majority of the responsibility. But Alex and I would still be there to help in smaller ways. It wasn't ideal, but it was the best solution we could come up with. As the conversation wound down, I felt a sense of closure creeping in. I had said my piece. And while the guilt wasn't entirely gone, it was less suffocating now. I had set my boundaries. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I was allowed to have them. I wasn't the one who had to fix everything anymore. I wasn't the one who had to hold the family together. As I left Alex's apartment that night, I realized that this was the beginning of a new chapter, not just for me, but for all of us. We were adults now, and we had to make adult decisions, even if they were painful. But we weren't kids anymore. We weren't stuck in that broken house, living in the shadow of our mother's mistakes. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe again. For the first time in years, I felt like I was finally stepping into my own life, unburdened by the past. The conversation with my brothers hadn't been easy, but it had given me the clarity I needed. I had set my boundaries, and they respected them. The guilt was still there, lingering like an old scar, but it no longer consumed me. I could move forward knowing that I had done what was right for myself, even if it hadn't been the easiest choice. The days after our conversation felt strangely quiet. I was used to the constant hum of worry, the nagging feeling that I needed to be responsible for everyone else. But now, there was a stillness in its place. It wasn't a perfect stillness. I still thought about Mom, about what the future held, but it was quieter. I had more space to breathe, to think about my own life for a change. My wife, Sarah, noticed the change in me right away. She had been there through all of it, silently supporting me as I wrestled with my past and my responsibilities. She never pushed me to make decisions I wasn't ready for. And for that, I was grateful. But I could see the relief in her eyes when I told her how things had gone with my brothers. She had always wanted me to set boundaries, to let go of the weight that wasn't mine to carry. Now that I had, it was like we were finally able to move forward together. "I'm proud of you," she told me one night as we sat on the couch, her hand resting on mine. "I know that wasn't easy, but you did what you needed to do." I nodded, feeling a sense of calm wash over me. It wasn't easy, but I think it was necessary. She smiled at me, her eyes soft with understanding. "It's been a long time coming. You deserve to live your life without carrying everyone else's burdens." I knew she was right, but part of me was still adjusting to the idea that I could live without that constant pressure. For so long, my identity had been tied to being the responsible one, the caretaker. It felt strange to let go of that role, even though I knew it was what I needed. The weeks passed, and I found myself thinking less and less about the conversation with Mom, about the looming fear of being her caretaker. My brothers and I had made a plan, and for now, that was enough. I wasn't being called upon to fix everything anymore, and that was a new feeling I was learning to embrace. One afternoon, I got a text from Alex. It was short, just a quick update about Mom. She had gone to the doctor for a routine checkup. And everything was fine. No major health scares. No immediate concerns. But even that simple message made me realize how much things had changed. A year ago, I would have been the one coordinating the doctor's appointments, checking in on her, making sure everything was taken care of. Now, Alex and Mark were taking on those responsibilities. I was still in the loop, but I wasn't the one running the show anymore. And that felt good. Liberating, even. For so long, I had been waiting for the other shoe to drop, for something catastrophic to happen that would pull me back into that role. But now, I realized that I didn't have to live in constant fear of that. Even if something did happen, if Mom's health took a turn or she needed more help, I wasn't alone in dealing with it. My brothers were there, and they had shown me that they were capable of handling things without me bearing the full weight. It wasn't just about Mom, either. My relationship with Alex and Mark had shifted in a way that felt healthier. More balanced. For years, I had felt like a second parent to them. Someone who had to protect and guide them at every turn. But they weren't kids anymore. They were adults, and they were fully capable of making their own decisions, of taking care of themselves and each other. It was a realization that filled me with both pride and a sense of relief. I had done my part, and now it was their turn to step up, and they were doing it. I started to think more about my own future, about the life Sarah and I were building together. We had always talked about traveling more, about focusing on our careers and enjoying the freedom that came with not having children. For the first time, those plans didn't feel like distant dreams overshadowed by the responsibilities of my family. They felt real, tangible. I could actually imagine a future where I wasn't tethered to my past, where I could make decisions based on what I wanted, not what I felt obligated to do. Sarah and I started planning a trip, something we had been talking about for years but had never gotten around to. It wasn't anything extravagant, just a week away, somewhere quiet and peaceful, where we could recharge and focus on each other. As we talked about the details, I felt a sense of excitement I hadn't felt in a long time. This trip wasn't about running away from my responsibilities or escaping my family. It was about embracing the life I had worked so hard to create. It was about allowing myself to enjoy the present without being haunted by the past. A few days before we were set to leave, I got a call from Mark. He sounded a little nervous, like he was trying to find the right words. For a moment, I braced myself, wondering if something had happened with Mom. But when he finally spoke, it wasn't about her at all. I just wanted to say thanks, he said, his voice hesitant, for everything you did when we were kids. I don't think I ever really understood how much you took on back then. But I get it now. I was caught off guard. Mark wasn't one to talk about his feelings. And hearing him acknowledge everything I had done for him and Alex was something I hadn't expected. It was the kind of validation I didn't even know I needed. But hearing it from him meant more than I could put into words. "You don't have to thank me," I said after a long pause, my throat tight with emotion. "I did what I had to do." "I know," he replied, but I still wanted to say it. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace. It wasn't just about setting boundaries with my mom or stepping back from the caretaker role. It was about finally feeling seen. Understood. My brothers had grown up. They understood what I had sacrificed for them. And they appreciated it. And that, more than anything, gave me the closure I had been seeking for years. As I hung up the phone, I realized that the future wasn't something to be afraid of anymore. I had done my part. I had given everything I had to give. And now, it was time for me to live my life on my own terms. The guilt, the resentment, the fear, they weren't gone completely. But they didn't define me anymore. I could move forward, knowing that I had done the best I could with the hand I'd been dealt. And that was enough. As Sarah and I packed for our trip, I felt lighter than I had in years. The road ahead was finally mine to walk, free from the shadows of my past.